I want to do two things to my bike today. I have 24,000 miles on it, and it's time to change the front tire, and also I've looked at the front brake pads and they definitely need to be replaced as well. So I want to show those out there how easy this is to do it right here in your garage, to be able to not only replace your front brakes but also replace the tire as well, or disassemble it to take it to get the tire replaced. The first thing that we're going to do is make sure that we have all our tools together. This is everything we need to be able to replace brake pads and take the front tire off the bike. We have just a couple of sockets, 17 millimeter with a 13 millimeter wrench, which is a 10 millimeter, and then only two Torx, a number 6 and a number 14 for your axle. And then, of course, clippers, tie wraps, and the hammer is for maybe just a little bit of tapping to, once you get the axle loose, might have to tap it a little bit to work it out. Your C-clamp for clamping down on your calipers. And that's it. So what we can start doing is we start with clippers. And then what we're going to do first, since your war bonnet is powered, we want to go ahead and since we're going to remove the fender as well, we want to go ahead and clip the tie wraps, get this unplugged, so that when we do get to the point where we are going to remove the front fender, we're not going to yank our connector apart. Like I said, it's just held together by a couple of tie wraps up in the engine, then that's it right there. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to get our number 13 and our number 10, and we're going to use these to take the brake covers. Now we have two number 13s, and also we have a bolt under here we got to take off as well. So what we'll do, we'll go ahead and get these loosened up. Take off the washers, and then I'll reach under here. Okay, and that exposes our brake. Now we're going to use our number 6. I also use my wrench. We have 3 bolts on each side, so a total of 6 bolts that we have to take out so that we can remove the fender. Now that the 6 bolts are removed, we can now take the fender. Now make sure your cable does not get caught. Rock this forward. We'll set this aside. Now that we have the fender out of the way, I want to start disassembling the brake pads. I'm going to use 2 things for that. Our 17 millimeter socket and tie wraps. The tie wraps we're going to use, I'm going to use the highway bars to wrap the tie wraps around and hold my calipers out of the way. Okay, now we're ready to take the 2 bolts out. We only have 2 bolts that hold in the brake caliper. Now that these bolts are out of the way, I can go ahead and just pull back on the caliper. It slides right out. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my bungee, wrap it around my highway bar, and now I got it safe and secure, so I don't have to worry about it falling, breaking any lines. Now that I got that side done, I'll go to the other side. Okay, the 2 bolts are out. Slide the caliper back. Now we're going to lower the bike just to give that front wheel a little bit of resistance. That axle, it has 52 foot-pounds. That front axle is on there nice and snug, and so you need to have a little bit of leverage. Now that we have the brake calipers out of the way, there are 2 things we need to loosen up to get the front axle out. And that's our 14 millimeter and our number 6 for the pinch bolts. We're going to start by loosening the 2 pinch bolts, and once we have these out of the way, then we have the axle that we need to loosen up. Our T14 and a cheater bar. Got it loose. Okay, now we have it backed out. Now what we're going to do is we're going to jack the bike back up, and we're going to see how we can get that axle slid out of place. Now we'll jack the bike up just enough to get the weight off the front end. There we go, we're done. Now that we have our axle loose, what we'll need to do is use a hammer and a little bit of chisel just to tap it just enough to get it loose enough to start working out of place. Now that's a little bit of loose. We'll see what we can do as far as putting pressure on the wheel and sliding the axle out. Now the axle's coming out pretty easy. We do have spacers on each side of the tire. The nice thing about the spacers, they're both identical, the same size, so we don't have to worry about switching left to right, right to left. Now we got the axle out of the way, spacers. Now the tire is completely loose. ready to take it down to the shop, get a new tire put on. Today's a new day. I have the tire mounted. So now what we're ready to do is put the tire in place, and once we have it in place, we're going to start with the brake pads. There is no left and right to the spacers. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and get those in place before we slide the axle and the tire in place. But make sure that when you do mount your tire, that on the left-hand side, you have your anti-lock disc and your ABS sensor on your left side. And we'll start the axle in place. Put in just enough lift on the tire, get it started. We're working it through. Okay, now it is in place. We can start tightening it down, and once we get it to a nice snug tightness, we'll set it on the ground and we'll torque it to the correct specifications. We'll go ahead and tighten the axle down. Again, this is a T14. Okay, it's just snug down. Now what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll put my pinch bolts in place, get those started, but I will not lock these down until I get the correct foot-pounds put on my axle. Okay. Now that I have the axle in place, we're going to go ahead and lower the bike, put a little drag on the front wheel so that we can put this specific torque on the axle. Specifications for foot-pounds is 56. Now that I have the axle tightened down, now we'll tighten our pinch bolts to 18 foot-pounds. Our front tire is mounted. We're going to now raise the bike because I just want to check just to make sure everything rotates freely. We have no issues at all with the mounting. Now that the bike has been lifted up off the ground, we're going to go ahead and spin it. Looks perfect. I'm ready to put some miles on this tire. Now we're ready to start on the brakes. Let's go ahead and see what comes in this package. Brand new from Indian. So on your front brakes, you have a left and a right hand side, so 2 pair for your front. Those will be placed in the back. And then in this packet, have the bolt to lock the pads in place. Push down, we have lubricant, and this little thing right here. What that's going to do is once we get this put in place, that's like a little snap ring. That'll hold that in place so it doesn't work back out again. We're ready to start the disassembly of the brake pads. I'll go ahead and loosen this up. So now first what we need to do is get this locking pin out of place. Just now got it loose, we have to work it out. Put a little pressure on this little plate back here. Once you have it loose, the thing will come right out. There are the old pads. Now what we need to do before we put everything in place is to make sure that we collapse our calipers so that when we try to slide it back on the disc, it's not pinching it too tight. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and let me lock this, put this back in place, because what I'm going to do is with the new pads, it comes with this little thing of silicone. And so what I'll do is I'll add that to the pads and then put these in place. Now that we got the silicone on the pads, probably the easiest way to do this is go ahead and put your spring in place. Now I'll take the pad that starts on the side of the bolt. I'll go ahead and slide that in place. Then I'll start the pin. I'll get that pin in place, and once I have it started, I'll go ahead and slide in the other side. Okay, now we got that in place. Now that we've got our little locking washer, now that we have the brake pads in, the screw, the locking washer, I'm going to go ahead and torque this down to 18 foot-pounds. Now we're ready to put the caliper back in place. Okay. Now that we got the caliper in place, what I want to go ahead and do is I'll go ahead and lock these down to 22 foot-pounds. Now we're set. This side is done. Now it's in place. Everything looks good. We'll go ahead and we'll do the same thing on the other side. Finished putting on the caliper for the right side of the bike. Now we're ready to move on to the next step. Putting the fender on. Now we're ready to start putting our front fender on. Now that we're ready to put our fender in place, make sure that this cable does not get pushed to the wrong side. Doesn't get pinched, but definitely gets set in the right place. Now we're ready to put our screws in place. Again, we have 3 bolts on each side. We'll lock this in place. Just loosely get them started. Now that we have the bolts in place, fenders mounted, we're going to go ahead and torque this to specs, and that's at 18 foot-pounds. Before I put the caliper cover on, I'm going to go ahead and put a tie wrap right here. Now that we got that cable tied, we'll go ahead and put our cover in place. Now you can go ahead and you can tilt this just a little bit to get that bolt on the inside started. And that'll kind of help you so you don't have to fight with it. Get the outside, and again, the specifications are 18 foot-pounds. So basically just hand tight. That's nice. Now that we have that secure, we're going to go ahead and finish this side off with 2 more tie wraps. And what I'll do, I'll go ahead and get this plugged in place. Our 3rd tie wrap in place. We'll repeat the same as we did to the other side. Everything's tightened down in place. We're ready to take this thing out and give it a test. Before I take this thing out for a test ride, I want to make sure that the brakes are pumped up. So that feels good right there. Now we're ready to take it out for a roll.